This evening's speaker is Professor Susan Neiman, and we had a discussion about the correct pronunciation of her surname. But now that she works in Germany, it probably should be pronounced Neiman, but anyway, we'll go with Neiman because that's what she was brought up with. And she's the director of the Einstein Forum in Potsdam in Germany. And her series, as some of you I know will have attended other parts of the series, her series is entitled Heroism for a Time of Victims. And this evening we're to hear the fourth of her 6 lectures entitled George Eliot, Heroes Without Faith. Just a couple of facts for you. First of all, the lecture and questions this evening are being recorded, and the video will shortly be available online on the University's Gifford Lectures web pages and blog. And at the end, I'll say something about the next lecture in the series and also a seminar to which you're all very warmly invited. But for now, it's for me to pass over to Professor Susan Neiman. Susan, welcome to Edinburgh, welcome to the University, and thank you for giving us the Gifford Lectures and tonight's 4th in the series. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Am I properly hooked up? Can people in the back hear me? Very good. I spent a couple of hours this morning trying desperately to shorten this lecture. It's very hard to shorten George Eliot. As those of you who know and love her will know, it's hard to know where to stop. So settle back into your seats. This will be a little bit longer than the other lectures, though not terribly much. I put on these photos at the beginning. I know there was a question at the beginning whether George Eliot pretended to be a man. She certainly did not. This is a plaster cast of her hand, and these are shoes and a dress that she regularly wore. Was she beautiful or not beautiful? Readers of George Eliot's final novel will know these as the words with which Daniel Deronda begins. And even for the novel's heroine, Gwendolen Harless, the question was not entirely settled. 19th century London never seemed to tire of discussing the looks of its most famous author. Henry James described her as magnificently ugly, deliciously hideous, while writing to his father that he was literally in love with this great horse-faced bluestocking. Turgenev said something similar. I know that she's not attractive, but when I'm with her, I do not see this. But perhaps this was just the male gaze. Here's the judgment of a lesser-known female writer. Some people have talked of the ugliness of this woman because, forsooth, she lacked dimpled cheeks, round eyes, and pretty mouth. If hers was ugliness, would we had more of it in the world? Men and women alike wrote of the beauty of her voice and her eyes, and something greater than beauty. When she spoke, quote, a positive light would flash from them, a luminosity irradiating not her own person only, but her surroundings. But why begin an homage to one of the 19th century's greatest writers by wondering about her beauty? Were we speaking of Tolstoy, her only certain peer, we would wonder less. That's the young Tolstoy. That is the first drawing we have of Eliot. She did not like to be represented, and there's only one photograph, which we'll see later. George Eliot transcended every expectation which shackled women of her time and many in ours. Why be concerned with the one quality in which she didn't? Well, for one thing, it concerned her. From childhood, she felt keenly the ways she did not conform to standards of female beauty. In an age when marriage was the only respectable occupation open to women, the absence of the easiest way toward it must have cast dread over her young life. One hopes she later looked back on her early prospects with satisfaction in the fact that she enjoyed one of the happier marriages in history. But quite beyond any question of her person, Eliot was exquisitely sensitive to beauty and the ways it could bring both misery and joy. She was an excellent pianist, and her descriptions of concerts could be rapturous. But she could also be passionate about flowers, and her description of the English Midlands, where she spent her childhood, are exquisite precisely because she could see things in those vistas rarely considered the most striking parts of the planet. One is attached to the landscape where one first became human, she wrote. Marianne Evans first became human in unprepossessing landscapes in which she loved to walk, even after she'd walked round the Italian lakes and the Swiss Alps. A typical journey entry records a headache so strong she could not work, so we walked for 3 or 4 hours. Her usual walks were down country lanes teeming with insects and untamed stalks of wheatgrass, which Eliot described with love and wonder. Perhaps their very ordinariness allowed her to take them in. No mountaintop wrapped in cloud or rocking waves on cliffs could distract from the ordinary beauty of a country hedge, which yields nothing more spectacular than an occasional startled blackbird. But light, as Eliot wrote, changes everything. If there's one thing to be learned from all of her novels, it's surely just this. The most ordinary people contain all the good and evil ever found in old tales of valor. She loved Walter Scott, whose novels she often read aloud to her father. Of Carlyle, whose laments over the death of heroism were legion, she wrote, "There's hardly an active mind of his generation that has not been modified by his writings." But George Eliot, I will argue, gives us the conditions of the possibility for modern heroism, a heroism no less deep and serious for its loss of classical drama. You need only look carefully and closely to see it, the way you might learn to look at an unremarkable English meadow and find what Adam Bede calls transient glory. Being George Eliot, she reflected on this process. Writing about the painter John Ruskin, she said his work taught the truth of realism, the doctrine that all art and beauty are to be attained by a humble and faithful study of nature. The thorough acceptance of this doctrine would remold our life. It will be no surprise that she delighted in Dutch paintings for this rare, precious quality of truthfulness, although, she said, lofty-minded people despise them. The 19th century was less abashed than ours in assuming that something like Plato's equation was true. One way or other, the true and the good and the beautiful are connected, even when they seem out of joint. Shortly after he rejected Eliot's affections, Herbert Spencer wrote 2 essays on personal beauty that argued for a necessary relationship between ugly features and inferiority of intellect and character. The saying that beauty is only skin deep is but a skin deep saying, he said. The ugly features he described were remarkably like Eliot's. Amazingly, their friendship continued. So the discussion of George Eliot's physical beauty had an edge. If she was ugly, could her books be true or good? Early on, the writer Mrs. Gaskell said it openly. She hoped against hope that Marianne Evans was not, as was rumored, the author of a book so beautiful and noble as Adam Bede. Evans had chosen a pen name, not only, like Charlotte Bronte, to ensure her books were not dismissed as ladies' fiction, but to ensure that they were read at all and not caught up in the scandal that surrounded her openly living with a married man. For Mrs. Gaskell, as for most Britons of the day, such a breach of morals could hardly be reconciled with the authorship of a book so good. To be fair to Elizabeth Gaskell, she later apologized to Eliot. But then so did many who refused contact with her until she became very famous. Eliot did not simply reject the connections between truth, goodness, and beauty. She reflected on them. Here Eliot defends Adam Bede for loving a beautiful girl who is so empty-headed that only the prospect of impending execution leads her to discover a soul. Quote, "Ask yourself if you were ever disposed to believe evil of any pretty woman. I find it impossible not to expect some depth of soul behind a deep gray eye with a long dark eyelash, in spite of experience which has shown me they may go along with deceit, peculation, and stupidity." End quote. Should you think the relations between beauty and virtue to be an obsolete question, please stop to consider the amount of time and money that women, and increasingly men, spend today in the effort to construct face and figure to meet contemporary ideas of what people should look like. My daughter's generation, alas, is far more consumed by it than mine was. Surely the obsession with appearance would wane without the unspoken but definite assumption that those who look good have other good qualities. It's an assumption that Eliot's novels challenge but don't quite overthrow. Some conspicuously beautiful characters, Tito and Romola, Rosamond and Middlemarch, do a great deal of evil, while Mary Garth, whose plainness is always underscored, is both the best and most sensible person in Middlemarch. Another lesson that runs through all her work is so banal we forget to take it seriously. Life is complicated. Leave aside faces for words on paper, and you may ask the same question. Was she beautiful or not beautiful? Was Eliot an artist or a philosopher? The question seemed more urgent when philosophers were less rigid, but even an age that thrilled to Rousseau saw some difference between truth and beauty. When you're looking for the latter, it's unlikely you'll turn to philosophy. Even I don't. The 19th century chopped up disciplines differently than we do, and its most brilliant men often worked to be in more than one. Nearly all were men. Eliot's common-law husband, George Henry Lewis, may not have left works destined to last centuries, but during his life he was known as one of the more brilliant critics of his time, who wrote several plays as well as, among other things, a biography of Goethe, a history of philosophy, and a treatise on psychology. Blessed with so much intellectual abundance, is it important to characterize? Even in authors now usually called philosophers, work was more fluid than it is today. Both Schopenhauer, whom Eliot detested, and Rousseau, whom she loved, transgressed boundaries between truth and beauty. Eliot certainly cared about the one as much as the other. It cannot be an accident that the two philosophers she chose to translate, Spinoza from the Latin and Feuerbach from the German, celebrated the unity of body and mind. In addition to translating from Latin and German, she also read Greek, French, Italian, Spanish, and a fair amount of Hebrew. From early youth, she amplified the native brilliance with which she was born through rigorous study of roughly everything. It's a habit she maintained all her life, rereading the classics while keeping abreast of the latest developments in French and German philosophy, as well as medicine and anthropology. Darwin interested her no more and no less than Turgenev. With her phenomenal wealth of learning, she was, wrote one critic, the reverse of a pedant. One scholar of myth, amazed at her knowledge of debates over the unity of the Iliad and the Odyssey, equally appreciated that she wore her learning without putting on any airs. She talked of Homer as simply as she would talk of flat irons. Surely she was joking when referring to herself as the model for Casaubon. The evident erudition in her novels even led some to wonder if they count as art at all. More than once she's been compared to Kant in knowledge, philosophic power, and moral seriousness. This sometime Kant scholar would agree. Her novels are novels of principle. Her masterful authorial interventions are not only comments on character, but flashes of wisdom. Wasn't that the aim of philosophy? And then there's her biography. She began her career writing essays and translating theory, only turning to write the novels for which she's remembered at the age of 40, thanks to Lewis's encouragement. Almost all the best books in the world, she wrote before she'd written one, have been written with the hope of getting money for them. At the time, they were broke. Now, anyone suspicious of books written for money should reflect on her claim that there is something antiseptic in the mere healthy fact of working for one's bread. But all these things could and have created skepticism about whether her works were really art. Even by 19th century standards, they can seem ponderous to read. None of them have the lightness that allows us to dive into Jane Austen without wondering why we're moved by the lives of people who have so little in common with our own. The great critic Harold Bloom thought Eliot a clumsy stylist, far more immersed in the philosophical than the narrative tradition. Bloom even claimed she lacked any sense of the comic, Very odd claim for anyone who has reveled in the comic figures of Mr. Brooke or Mrs. Glegg. But however many jokes Harold Bloom failed to get, he nonetheless wrote that no one after Eliot has achieved her peculiar and invaluable synthesis between the moral and the aesthetic, and perhaps it will never be achieved again. The proof is in the reading, and I dare the reader to turn or return to Middlemarch without finding sentences to bring a smile or sigh of delight on approximately every other page. But while the author clearly means us to find delight along the way, every novel is in part philosophical mission. If we take the first philosophical question to be, how shall we live? Plato thought it was, and there's still much to be learned by reading him, but Eliot's questions are closer to ours, not only in time. I'll explain in a moment. I've hinted at the highlights, but for those who don't know it, here's an outline of her story. Born in 1819 as Marianne Evans in rural Warwickshire, she was the youngest child of Robert Evans, whom she tended and adored. Her mother, who died early, played little role in her life, but her father served as inspiration for two of her novel's heroes, Adam Bede and Caleb Garth. Himself the son of a carpenter, Evans never became part of the gentry, but by taking good care of their property, he earned enough to provide his family with a comfortable living. It's the house she grew up in. I would say it's pretty comfortable. Evans was conventionally religious, but his deepest beliefs concerned the honor and honesty and work well done, values he instilled in his daughter. Her brilliance was recognized early. Following the end of the secondary education to which girls were restricted, she took private lessons in languages and mathematics. From the age of 15, she also organized and gave lessons to minors' children who remembered her decades later with fond reverence. Her father did what he could in the way of moving to increase her marriage prospects, but she was more interested in Coventry's free-thinking circle around Charles and Cara Bray, the first friends who mentored and challenged her and encouraged her growing doubts about religion. She kept house and cared for her father until he died. She was 30 when she left home and went abroad, and thence to London. By living very frugally, she could support herself in London as a translator and writer of elegant and erudite essays that blended literary criticism with philosophy and theology, but you could call it anti-theology. Soon enough, though never sufficiently paid or acknowledged, she was the editor of the Westminster Review, a cutting-edge quarterly originally founded by Jeremy Bentham as an organ of the so-called philosophical radicals. In Eliot's day, it regularly published the likes of John Stuart Mill, Mary Shelley, and Herbert Spencer, as well as Huxley's first discussion of Darwinism. The unassuming brilliance of the young woman from the countryside was quickly recognized. "There is no one living who is better to talk to," wrote Edward Burne-Jones. Many spoke of her ability to bring out the best ideas in others. "All in all," wrote an old friend, "she would undoubtedly have achieved a very great position in the London world quite independently of her novels had she not deliberately cast away her social position when she left for Germany with Mr. Lewis." It was probably the greatest scandal of its day. "We all regarded the union as a calamity," wrote her oldest friend, who, like Eliot's own brother and sister, refused to contact her for years thereafter. Marianne Evans had fallen in love before, most clearly and unrequitedly with Herbert Spencer, whose autobiography later recorded that, quote, "Physical beauty is a sine qua non with me, as was once unhappily proved, where the intellectual traits and the emotional traits were of the highest order." He died alone. And she was lucky that Spencer's taste was so conventional. For shortly after he dashed her hopes for romance, she found the love of her life, George Henry Lewis, when she was 34. Lewis was already married to Agnes, with whom he fathered 3 children. By acknowledging the fourth as his own, though he knew it was fathered by his erstwhile best friend, Lewis forfeited the right to divorce under the laws of the time. So much for the rewards of behaving like a gentleman. Agnes eventually bore 7 children, all supported by Lewis, though only 3 of them were his, leaving himself and his new love in dire financial straits until her novels became bestsellers. Among other things, Marianne Evans was branded a homewrecker. Decades later, her stepson Charles Lewis responded to the charge. Quote, "My mother had left my father before he and George Eliot ever met each other. George Eliot found a ruined life, and she made it into a beautiful life. She found us poor little motherless boys, and what she did for us, no one on earth will ever know." Eliot's devotion to those she called our boys ranged from supporting them financially to nursing Charles' younger brother, who died of tuberculosis, in her arms. Now, love out of wedlock was hardly unknown in Victorian England, but people were expected to enjoy it in private. Eliot and Lewis spent their first months together on the continent, where convention was more forgiving. Returning to London to live together openly violated every taboo the English imposed on women, and women in particular shunned her for fear that contact would taint their own moral standing. Eliot called herself Mrs. Lewis and wrote to her brother's lawyer that while her marriage was not a legal one, it is regarded by both of us as a sacred bond. Isaac Evans, that's him, nevertheless broke off relations for the 25 years of that union. The historian Lord Acton, later a friend of Eliot and Lewis, wrote that she paid the price of losing liberty of speech, the foremost rank among women of her time, and a tomb in Westminster Abbey. Acclaimed throughout England late in life, second not even to Shakespeare, some wrote, Eliot was denied the country's greatest literary honor, burial in the Poets' Corner of Westminster Abbey, since the church would not condone a life lived in sin. But Eliot would hardly have preferred conventional honor and death to the life she lived with Lewis. Besides, it's unlikely she would have become a great writer without his constant encouragement and support. When they began to live together, his star was much higher than hers, as he'd already published a good deal in several genres. Theirs was a marriage of intellectual and erotic passion so intense, some observers found it unseemly. These are gifts that he gave to her. The ring is an opal, which she said she liked the opal because it seemed to have a soul of its own. It changed so often, and he gave her the piano as a 50th birthday present. Long before he met Eliot, Lewis's attitudes towards women were remarkable for his time. Lewis and Eliot shared moral convictions and unending curiosity, encouraging and contributing to each other's work. Eliot records the pleasure of collecting sea urchins in tide pools for Lewis's studies in marine biology. And Lewis spent hours taking notes in the library women were forbidden to enter when they traveled to Florence so Eliot could do research for her novel, Romola. Evenings they didn't spend together reading aloud to each other from Shakespeare or Goethe were spent reading each other's works in progress. It was Lewis who first suggested she try her hand at fiction, and he soon became her unofficial agent and manager, shielding her from any outside concern that might interfere with her writing. Her first novel, Adam Bede, was successful enough to move them from cramped rooms to a comfortable house. After the second, The Mill on the Floss, was equally well received, they were freed not only from poverty, but from social stigma, and people began to visit their Sunday salons where the great and the good vied for invitations. Bouts of ill health shadowed their happiness, and it's impossible to know how much these affected Eliot's frequent expressions of melancholy, even depression. When Lewis died suddenly in November 1878, Eliot was so grief-stricken she couldn't attend his funeral. A few months later, she roused herself in order to complete his unfinished manuscript, Problems of Life and Mind. 18 months after Lewis's death, George Eliot shocked London again, this time with a church wedding to John Cross, a businessman 20 years her junior. Cross had become both financial advisor and close friend to Eliot and Lewis. We can only conjecture how he moved from that role to become her spouse. Since after her death he destroyed every piece of paper he deemed unworthy of the woman he adored as a secular saint. Great loss. We don't even know how much he destroyed. Eliot knew the marriage would draw strong criticism, both because of their age difference and the short span between it and Lewis's death. The lone exception to her prediction was her brother Isaac, who wrote to congratulate her on the marriage after nearly a quarter century of silence. Intellectually, Cross was in no way Lewis's equal, but he took care of her with devotion, as Lewis had done till she died 7 months after her wedding. Accompanied by hundreds of mourners, she was buried next to Lewis in Highgate Cemetery. But why write of her life at all when she herself wrote, in a line that's quoted at the beginning of every biography of her, that a writer's deeds are his words? She never wrote an autobiography. Given her exquisite ability to chronicle the inner life, one wishes she had left an account of her own that reflected the delicate mixture of humility and ambition which characterized it. Surely she could have analyzed it better than the legions of admirers, including this one, who have tried. As women readers in particular have complained, she never invented a heroine whose life was as interesting and brave as her own, though bits of her young self were captured in Maggie Tulliver and Dorothea Brooke. Her heroines were always constrained by the social limits few women of her time overcame, reflecting a commitment to realism few but Eliot actually transcended in real life. What we have of her later journals, the ones Cross didn't burn, are mostly notes of what she read and wrote that day, frequently punctuated by the words "depressed again," and a list of who came to dinner. Yet her attempts to separate life and work can't stop us from asking, would George Eliot belong in a book about heroism had she led another life? You needn't imagine her as a hypocrite or a scoundrel. Just imagine her as Jane Austen or Charlotte Bronte. We would still read her novels as we read theirs, with great admiration, as Eliot did. But it's hard to imagine we would valorize her had she not had the courage to challenge so many of the norms that bound women of her day. Her own characters rarely do so. Here her moral determination to see the world as it is got the upper hand. Honesty, for her, is the first and hardest duty, and self-deception is a major theme of each of her novels. Infused with ideals, she rarely felt the need to assert them. Rather, she spent much of her life resisting the urge to see the world through ideal lenses. She was profoundly aware of the ways our lives are structured by the conventions and pressures which frame them, aware of how much force it takes to defy them. If she defied them in her own life, she would not be self-righteous in expecting others to do the same. And it's this combination of clear moral convictions and humility that made such an impression on everyone who met her. Like Adam Bede, she strove to make the world a bit better than she found it, without shutting her eyes to the fact that her best efforts were little match for the world's sorrows. This is the imperative she held essential for modern heroism, along with the understanding of how hard this simple-seeming imperative is to follow. Great-souled people born to be heroes can be annihilated both by social conditions and their own self-deception. In Eliot's work, the latter is always the greatest danger. In the last decade of her life, she was surrounded by people who idealized, even idolized her, but she wasn't confused by the hype. If I hadn't been human with feelings and failings like other people, she told her stepson Charles, how could I have written my books? Heroes have feelings and failings. As I've said before in these lectures, they're decidedly not saints. While I'd hesitate to call her heroic without the strength of mind and heart that suffused her life, without the work she produced, she would have raised no more, if no less, admiration than Dorothea, of whom she wrote in the final pages of Middlemarch. That things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who have faithfully lived a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. The lesson is important, but Eliot belonged to the other half. Her work offers an analysis of modern heroism. It shows us how intellectual virtues, above all a commitment to honesty, become moral ones, and both have to do with taste. The true, the good, and the beautiful are not identical, and their appearance may surprise you. At their best, however, they resonate and light each other's ways. Eliot's work was written under a sense of crisis. Like my own generation, she knew she was stuck between ages. She was raised in the pastoral world where most of her novels were set. Rumblings of the Industrial Revolution still to come can be found in farmers' resistance to the coming of the railroad. Even more importantly, she was raised in the strong faith which she paints with respect, but overthrew after years of painful study. We may no longer feel the force of the triple onslaught on Christianity that took place in the years she came of age. Between modern biblical criticism, represented by David Strauss's Life of Jesus, which she translated from the German, geological studies which undermine the account of creation in Genesis, and Darwin's account of a world without purpose, no thinker as serious as Eliot could remain a traditional believer. Her renunciation of Christianity came with real costs. Her beloved father threatened to turn her out of the house, a somber prospect for an unmarried woman of no fortune. But more difficult to bear was surely the cost that Carlyle described. Quote, "For a pure moral nature, the loss of his religious belief was the loss of everything." Eliot's work can shade nostalgic, but her irony undercuts the impulse to long for a lost world, as Carlyle did. She knew the old world was gone and resolved to find a way to live and light the new. The highest calling, she wrote to a friend, is to do without opium. It's unlikely she had Marx's famous remark about religion in mind when she wrote those words. And she couldn't have read Freud, whose Civilization and Discontents states that intoxicating substances are one sure way of relieving the suffering caused by the fact that, as Freud put it, life is too hard for us. Freud thought that earlier infantile ages got their relief from religion, yet it was not the loss of God the Creator which could seem the loss of everything. Giving up on God was hard. Giving up on providence was excruciating. For providence is just the idea that there is meaning and preferably justice in the world. We mortals may not see it amid the chaos and cruelty so often before our eyes, but we can be comforted by the assurance that it's there. Now, this is the kind of comfort that Job rejected when offered by his so-called friends, the first Western thinkers to offer a rough theodicy. In my book, Evil in Modern Thought, I argued that it's useful to read the history of Western philosophy as a commentary on the book of Job. As Job moves from lamenting the injustice done to him to the sweep of the cosmos, his question becomes cosmic. Why is there such a gap between the way the world is and the way it ought to be? The idea of providence had been under assault for a century when Darwin dealt its death blow. Darwin's work was shocking, less because it showed our descent from monkeys. That's just a blow to our vanity. Far more painful to 19th century readers was his account of the accidents of creation. Didn't Hegel say the purpose of philosophy was to eliminate the contingent, thus showing the place of reason in the world? On Darwin's account, our very being, and that of most others, is shot through with contingencies in which no meaning or purpose can be found. Earlier thinkers, most notably Hume, offered similar accounts, but that was speculation. Darwin gave the arguments against design the stamp of science. Anyone trying to find reason in the world had henceforth all the resources of empiricism against her. No wonder beauty was so central and so fraught. It might have little to do with reason or even meaning, but it offered a whiff of consolation. Even Hume, whose speculations decisively destroyed the argument from design, admitted he could be stumped when faced with the wonders of the natural world. Who hasn't glanced at a dusk-driven seascape or a ragged mountain sunrise and thought, this is it, where it is ground for gratitude for the gift of being alive? So Eliot often gives us glimpses of that transient glory in the everyday landscapes where we first became human. They do not figure, however, in her search for reasons to be glad you were born, a phrase that recurs in several novels. Those reasons, she believed, can only come from other people. The most often quoted reminiscence of Eliot describes a walk with the master in the Fellows' Garden at Trinity College, Cambridge. That is the Fellows' Garden. I was really pleased when I was in Cambridge last week to get into it. And this is what the master, Mr. Myers, Dr. Myers said, taking as her texts the three words which have been used so often as inspiring trumpet calls of man, God, immortality, duty, she pronounced with terrible earnestness how inconceivable was the first, how unbelievable was the second, and yet how peremptory and absolute the third. It's the sort of thing that must have inspired Nietzsche's snide remark that the English must do penance for their emancipation from theology with displays of moral fanaticism, but, said Nietzsche, we do not wish to hold it against little moralistic females a la Eliot. One suspects he never bothered to open one of her books, which can be read as concentrated arguments against every form of moral fanaticism. She showed that the line between vice and virtue is not only hard to capture, the very effort to draw one prevents us from seeing either clearly. No wonder some of her contemporaries, as well as later scholars, have argued that the famous description of her walk in the Fellows' Garden is likely to be a caricature, too humorless to be typical of Eliot's speech. Yet even had Nietzsche read the best of her work, he would have opposed it, for her project is diametrically opposed to his. Nietzsche believed that the death of God and loss of belief in providence undermine not only the traditional foundations of morality, but the very idea of morality itself. It's a bold and important critique, which Nietzsche rightly said would be first understood 100 years after his death. We are living in its shadows, when the absence of clear foundations for truth and goodness has turned so many into nihilists and others into religious fanatics. Once the good and the true disappear, everything is permitted. Beauty is hardly an afterthought. This critique depends oddly on assumptions both cynical and reactionary, namely, that people only behave morally out of hope of heaven or fear of hellfire. For Eliot, few things could be more inimical to morality. In her scathing early essay on the religious poet Young, she wrote, quote, "It is quite possible that you would be a knave and love yourself alone, were it not for your belief in immortality, but you are not to force on me what would result from your own utter want of moral emotion. If you feel no motive to common morality but your fear of a criminal bar in heaven, you're decidedly a man for the police on earth to keep their eye on, since it's a matter of world experience that fear of distant consequences is a very insufficient barrier against the rush of immediate desire." She's young and, relatively young and unknown, and it's an incredibly scathing thing to write. For those like Carlyle, the loss of faith was the loss of everything because it spelled the end not only of hope, but of duty. All that remained to move us was desire and fear. It's an age-old trope which Eliot, like Kant before her, turns on its head. Anyone who is moved to be decent only because of traditional religion is not moved by morality, but by desire and fear. The implication spelled out in her later work is clear. Few of us have the kind of criminal mentality that can only be thwarted by a vision of the torments of the damned. And however common it may be to say today that nothing really moves us besides desire and fear, few of us actually behave that way in practice. Our motives for everything, as Eliot shows, are usually mixed. Both Eliot and Nietzsche grew up in deeply religious households, so it's not surprising that their loss of faith would shape their life projects. But for all his brashness and brilliance, Nietzsche's response was less bold than Eliot's. How easy it is to be moral when you believe your good deeds are reflected in the universe and will be infinitely rewarded. How easy it is to throw it all away when you grasp that the universe does not behave as you should. To reconstruct morality without religion is a far braver task. But the contemporary reader may be harder to persuade. Eliot deeply believed that the majority of human beings have natural moral sentiments, though it's just as natural for us to disregard them with clever rationalizations when other interests intrude. We feel sorrow and pity for others' suffering and occasionally even gladness for others' joy. There are plenty of studies, from primatology to social psychology, that demonstrate this, but for most of us, sheer introspection will work. Still, the critic may retort that those moral sentiments are just the relic of religious emotions that have yet to be fully extinguished. Nietzsche's argument for that was followed by some that seemed even more powerful. By the 21st century, a consensus emerged. Moral motivation must be deconstructed. What really moves human action is simpler and raw. A drive for what Hobbes called power after power, and a desire for the accumulation of stuff. Unlike Hobbes' own, this view is no longer dependent on speculation about the early history of humankind, but offered as the finding of those sciences often venerated with the fervor that once marked religious conviction: neoliberal economics and evolutionary psychology. What could Eliot's description of moral sentiments possibly say to them? Now, it's worth remembering that neither the founder of modern liberal economic theory nor the founder of evolutionary theory saw any contradiction in assuming the prevalence of strong moral sentiments alongside their path-breaking discoveries. We know that Darwin was not a social Darwinist. He never intended his work to justify the domination of the weak by the strong. An unbending abolitionist, he thought his work and his studies of indigenous peoples in South America showed the unity of humankind in contrast to common racist theories of his day. Now, a hard-nosed Nietzschean could say that Adam Smith and Charles Darwin were just as subject as ordinary mortals to shades of the religiously influenced moral psychology they couldn't shake off. There's a point in the argument where each side may be tempted to throw up their hands. But don't do so before thinking about the relationships between Darwin, Eliot, and Lewis. Eliot and Lewis read The Origin of Species shortly after it was published in November 1859, aloud to each other. They found themselves deeply in agreement with much of it. Though Eliot thought it was poorly written, Lewis later wrote 4 essays defending it. Darwin, for his part, respected Lewis's work and enjoyed Eliot's novels, though he preferred Adam Bede and Silas Marner to The Mill on the Floss because he thought, as he wrote in his autobiography, that there should be a law against books that end unhappily. Darwin was a guest at the Lewis's Sunday salons. Eliot and Lewis attended a séance with Darwin and others that was held at the London home of Darwin's brother Erasmus in 1874. One guest complained that Mr. Lewis was troublesome and inclined to make jokes and not play the game fairly and sit in the dark in silence. Lewis's diary records, "We left in disgust." Though Henry James thought Middlemarch sets a limit to the development of the old-fashioned English novel, he also complained that it was too often an echo of Monsieur Darwin and Huxley. Whatever the differences between Eliot's views of humankind and those of Darwin, the last thing she did was to ignore him. Her work not only grapples with the fact that his theories give the final blow to trust in providence. Even more clearly, her work and that of Lewis is engaged in very serious dialogue with the idea that evolutionary theory undermines morality. For the question had already been raised very clearly: would Darwin's world, a reflection not of the cosmic justice we called providence, but of blind chance and struggle, lead people to believe that self-interested behavior was more adaptive and give up any attempt to act morally? Lewis's Problems of Life and Mind, the book which Eliot edited after his death, addressed those questions at length. One example: the soul of man has a double root, a double history. Man's egoistic impulses, his concern for himself at the expense of others, are manifestations of his animal nature, but his moral life, his desire for the welfare of others, is the consequence of his relation to society. And the task of Eliot's novels is to show the moral education of the individual. Nothing makes this clearer than the oft-quoted sentence from Middlemarch: "We are all of us born in moral stupidity, taking the world as udder to feed our supreme selves." Her use of the word udder undermines our animality, and anyone who doubts the truth of that claim has never spent time with a toddler. Spending time with toddlers, however, will remind you how much they can be taught. Indeed, much of our interaction with toddlers consists in giving them the tools towards morality. That other animals feel pain just as you do, that hoarding is only a temporary pleasure, that giving can be joy, and patience necessity. Our first lessons to children consist in myriad ways of showing that despite the obstacles which the existence of other minds sometimes present, like their turn may come first, your cake may be shared, it is far, far better to learn to live with them than to live alone. Eliot's portraits of those characters who never get beyond seeing the world as their udder are portraits of hell. Yet Eliot's method is very far from earlier moralists, even Dickens, whom she both admired and criticized. First of all, there are no providential solutions. Sometimes the wicked are punished, sometimes they are not. Secondly, if they are punished, it's through the natural consequences of their actions. We are social beings, and living as such demands a certain amount of honesty, empathy, and generosity. Those who cannot find those qualities in themselves are usually doomed to fall. But Eliot's portraits of moral education are far more complex than showing how some sinners sometimes suffer. She's much more interested in showing how different sorts of people with very different failings and flaws can become one of those who makes others glad to be born. What makes us better people? There are no rules, which is why Eliot chose not to write moral treatises, but fiction. She's quite sure it isn't pain, and positively scathing about the idea that suffering ennobles, whether it's great or small. As Middlemarch tells us, it is a rather strong check on one's self-complacency to find out how much of one's right doing depends on not being in want of money. And because we are social beings, connected and influenced by a web of relations we can rarely escape, even great souls can bend their own judgment to fit the shape of convention. How many of us have sat on committees, I'm looking at the professors in the audience, and been tempted at the very least to do what Lydgate did to Fairbrother, persuading ourselves to vote with the majority when it eases our lives? When does compromise become rotten? Where does moral decay begin? No rule can do more than guide us, because rules must be applied to particular circumstances. Each of her novels offers minute analyses of the struggles of many quite different people, showing how their paths toward or away from moral heroism are composed of small and distinct decisions. Her empathy, otherwise known as the absence of moralism, stems from her knowledge of the way that social conditions shape and narrow our choices. Hence, her model of heroism is never the great-souled individual who, through force of will, is able to buck conventional restraints. I suppose John Brown would be an example of that, but as far as I know, she never commented on John Brown, although she corresponded at length with Harriet Beecher Stowe. Lydgate, the figure best describable as a great-souled, willed individual, fails miserably. For Eliot, this is why realistic analysis, not romantic modeling, is so important. The one may serve us as guide, the other will likely lead us astray. Examples of all these processes fill Eliot's work, but I'll focus and say a few more words about Middlemarch. To quote a letter of Emily Dickinson's, "What do I think of Middlemarch? What do I think of glory?" Middlemarch brings together a wealth of themes which give it claim to encompass all that matters in human life. At its core, however, are the tales of two marriages that reveal how two strong people with the best of intentions go wrong. As panoscopic as her novels are, nearly all are framed within the marriage plot, but nothing shows Eliot's commitment to realism as well as her subversion of that framework. Pride and Prejudice is not realistic, one reason it's so beloved, particularly by young women of no fortune. Eliot opened a window on what happens after the fairy tale courtship is traded for the burdens and joys of shared life in the real world. Why focus on something so common? Ordinary as it is, marriage has long been the most central event in women's lives. For women in Eliot's day, it was usually the one choice they ever made if they got to make it at all. Beginning with her very first novel, Eliot was excruciatingly aware of the restrictions that bound women's lives. Dinah wants to preach, Maggie wants an education, Dorothea dreams of sainthood, Gwendolen of adventure. All those desires are ultimately thwarted by the limited scope for women's action. But as Middlemarch shows so well, marriage can be just as central in determining men's lives, even if they think of it as simply a complement to who they are and what they do, which is usually centered on their profession. Indeed, the ways in which men's choice of partner may be an afterthought is precisely the problem. Lydgate's story reveals how the wrong marriage can be a man's undoing, a warning to all who believe that thinking about love is women's business. By creating that story, Eliot reminds us that erotic choices are usually the most significant ones we ever make, sending waves through our lives that persist long after the storm. The reader may see at once that the two main characters are headed towards miserable marriages and wonder how they can fail to see it themselves. But the point is not that they were dreadfully wrong. Eliot works to show us why they might reasonably have thought they were right. In both cases, a mixture of social constraint and personal flaw leads them to embittered doom. Dorothea's mismatch is easiest to understand. At the start of the book, she's only 19, and she yearns to be something better and do something larger than anyone or anything ever glimpsed in her narrow experience, that unlike St. Teresa's, left no space for intensity or greatness. Being handsome, with some fortune, marriage to someone is all but certain, and Casaubon is the first serious man she ever met. She's too callow to know the difference between seriousness, sententiousness, and sanctimony. The only men of her acquaintance, Sir James and her uncle, are ultimately ludicrous. On the basis of the very little knowledge available during courtship, she constructs a heroic picture of Casaubon and his work, imagining her contributions to it at his side, sadly enough, the largest field of action she can imagine. The fact that those around her disapprove of her choice only makes her more determined to marry. Certain that she and no other can see the depths of Casaubon's soul, its ultimate barrenness is obscured by the fact that others' opposition is so petty. What better way to show her strong-minded ability to stand against convention? Readers who don't yet know the plot will miss the humor in chapter 3 when Dorothea returns Sir James' gift of a puppy with the excuse that she might step on it. "I am rather short-sighted," she says. She entirely fails to see Sir James' attempts to court her, as well as Casaubon's real interest in her. Thinking a woman 27 years his junior can't possibly have the resources to judge him, he expects the silent admiration his distant colleagues never offered. But Dorothea is hardly the first person to be blind to the interest of a suitor she doesn't want, nor to the nature of a suitor she does. If she is short-sighted, it's a myopia that can befall any of us. Lydgate's short-sightedness is even more common, and many of Eliot's novels lambaste the thoughtlessness of men's attraction to women. But lambaste is too strong, for Eliot's goal here is to understand how serious men lose their wits when contemplating a beautiful woman. Eliot comments on the fact that Lydgate fails to use the considerable intellectual abilities he applies to science when thinking about women, but she doesn't excoriate him. True, she notes a self-satisfied laziness in his sexism. Meeting Dorothea, he notes her undeniable beauty before immediately musing that, quote, "the society of such women was about as relaxing as going from your work to teach second form, instead of reclining in a paradise with sweet laughs for bird notes and blue eyes for a heaven," end quote. Eliot is arch, but she captured inclinations still very much alive. I know plenty of men who explicitly refuse to give reasons for falling in love with this woman rather than that one, declaring that giving reasons for loving would amount to instrumentalizing it. It's a view long enshrined in complex as well as popular poetry. For the latter, consider the song "Some Enchanted Evening," which ends, "Who can explain it? Who can tell you why? Fools give you reasons. Wise men never try." Very un-Eliot kind of an idea. 40 years later, men who decline to give reasons may look skyward and say it was something in the curve of her neck, and wonder why they wake up to someone with whom they share nothing but a history of disappointment. Dorothea, by contrast, has nothing but reasons for her choice of Casaubon. Because of marriage's greater magnitude for women, it's something we learn to think about early. I'm not, of course, thinking of trivial reasons for marriage like wealth or position. Women in love are versed in hermeneutics. Why this remark should be read as a sign of generosity, that gesture understood as proof of kindness. But hermeneutics has its pitfalls. Anything could be overread. Dorothea can give reasons that are admirable and far more thoughtful than finding heaven in blue eyes. But without judgment, she can't apply them, and fails to see that her idealized vision of Casaubon bears little resemblance to the man at all. The young Dorothea is a walking argument against abstract idealism. Now, the development of the novel's minor characters is no less interesting, but can't be considered here. Middlemarch captures the education of two splendid people whose own weaknesses, exacerbated by the conventions of a world that's too small for their generous capacities, lead them to the brink of tragedy. Dorothea is saved from it by the authorial intervention that kills off Casaubon just before she signs away her life to keeping his impotent flame. Call that providence. Lydgate has no such luck. I take the difference in their fates to be a comment on the absence of providential intervention. There's no good reason why Lydgate's faults should utterly destroy all the promise of his life, except for the fact that such things do happen. Some mistakes can never be corrected. Some sorrow can only be borne. Though the novel is too rich to be merely didactic, few will deny that it shows us how two would-be heroes are undone, or almost undone, by their different kinds of failure to see the world as it is. From it, we can learn fundamental steps to moral awakening and enlarging our sympathies to understand others' perspectives. Following these steps would surely lead to better marriages and better human relations. But Eliot's novels, she indicated elsewhere, were written in hopes of aiding the social and political reformer. What can be learned from Eliot when we move from the individual to the larger political world? With all deference to Felix Holt, a radical, wrote Henry James, the author is essentially a conservative. It's a reproach that's followed her since James's day, and it's a strange claim to make about a woman who once wrote to a friend, "I'm a heathen and an outlaw." With so much on the brink in this year, 2022, it's hard to imagine that any form of conservatism could meet the challenges humankind faces. All of us know more or less consciously that the form of civilization we inhabit, left conserved, will destroy civilization itself and much else, call it nature, in its wake. Eliot's thought about work-class prejudice and social reform are wrapped around love stories, but all her novels have political implications. And the message in all of them is what she called gradualism, the belief that social progress can only take place through individual moral progress. She had good reason for skepticism about larger political upheavals. Eliot was born in the shadow of the French Revolution. Its descent into the reign of terror was a standing challenge to progressive thinkers of her day. It was far closer to her in time than the Russian Revolution is to ours, yet the latter still forms a cloud over our thought about radical political change. Yet the soldiers fighting for the revolution did so with copies of Rousseau in their backpacks. Eliot said it was worth the labor of learning French just to read Rousseau. Yet she didn't need Rousseau to find her sympathies squarely on the side of the working classes. That deep respect for good work, which shines through her novels, was itself radical in a world where social significance depended precisely on not having to work at all. The eligible bachelors with $5,000 a year who populate Austen's novels got that income from rents paid by farmers who tilled the soil those gentlemen inherited. There are no Mr. Darcys in Eliot's fiction. Her view of the gentry was expressed in Silas Marner. Oh, wait, sorry, that's some revolution that's actually not revolution. I mean, that's a picture from a contemporary illustration of the Sproxton riot she describes so well in Felix Holt, a radical. These are her view of the gentry. Men whose only work was to ride round their land, getting heavier and heavier in their saddles, and who passed the rest of their days in the half-listless gratification of senses dulled by monotony. Being Eliot, of course, she immediately reminded us that calamities come to them too. Yet though, or because, she grew up among working people, Eliot had no inclination to romanticize them. Her refusal to idealize the downtrodden is a product not only of realism, but of sympathy. As she shrewdly remarks on several occasions, if poverty and oppression produced happy, generous souls, there'd be no reason to oppose poverty and oppression. Just skip a little bit. She argues that it's one of working people's greatest, this is from Felix Holt, working people's greatest hardships that they've largely been prevented from sharing in the treasure of knowledge, science, poetry, refinement of thought, feelings of manners, great memories, and the interpretation of great records, which is carried on from the minds of one generation to the minds of another. Change is possible, she believed, through the spread of culture and the influence of people who are better than we are, like heroes. This is old-fashioned talk, someone may say. We know all that. That's a direct quote from Felix Holt, in which Eliot is speaking in her own voice. Of course, she knows that, quote, to insist on the preservation of order is the part of a selfish aristocracy and a selfish commercial class, because among these, in the nature of things, have been found the opponents of change. Eliot makes clear she's not among them. I am a radical. I expect great changes, and I desire them. Yet with characteristic independence, she argues that the instrumentalization of calls for order do not make order unnecessary. Through Holt, she refers to the riot she experienced as a child, which was brought about chiefly by the agency of dishonest men who profess to be on the people's side. Anyone who cannot hear the echoes of those words in 2022 has not been reading the news. The deepest political conviction that runs through her work was the abstract hope expressed in an early letter of a vision of the time when this miserable reign of mammon shall end. Given her insistence that political programs must be specifically suited to particular places and times, it's no surprise that she gave us no unambiguous political direction. She nonetheless provided some of the building blocks, above all, her passionate universalism. Her anti-racist commitments were deep. As she wrote to Harriet Beecher Stowe, "There's nothing I should care more to do, if it were possible, than to rouse the imagination of men and women to a vision of human claims in those races of their fellow men who most differ from them in customs and belief." This inability to find interest in any form of life that's not clad in the same coattails and flounces as our own lies very close to the worst kinds of irreligion. Neither racism nor anti-Semitism were concepts in use in her day, but her disgust in both was not confined to private letters. Daniel Deronda, of course, contains a long argument against the anti-Semitism so prevalent in her day. Eliot had a particular interest in Jews and a fearless eye for anti-Semitism. When Richard and Cosima Wagner visited the Lewis's salon, she remarked to her, "Your husband does not like Jews. My husband is a Jew." She therefore started a rumor which has never been proven and is probably false, but I like her trolling. Her sympathies extended to other peoples on society's margins. Her little red verse drama, The Spanish Gypsy, sympathizes both with the gypsies' aspirations to nationhood and their resistance to Spanish imperialism. Her last work, Impressions of Theophrastus Such, connects prejudice towards Jews with prejudice towards Black and Irish people. It also acknowledged that the Hindus have good reason to abhor England's historic rapacity and arrogant notions of our own superiority, and concludes by stating that we are a colonizing people and it's we who've punished others. All this adds up to remarkable criticism of the common attitudes of her day. Wait a minute. Like that of any truly great artist, Eliot's work is too rich to be reduced to any one theme or thought. Her works have mythological reverberations. At the same time, they're expanded by her commitment to realism, which abjures myth entirely. But even more important is her constant awareness of one central truth: the world is not mindful of us. As she observes, examining the world in order to find consolation is very much like looking carefully over the pages of a great book in order to find our own name, if not in the text, at least in a laudatory note. Whether we find what we want or not, our preoccupation has hindered us from a true knowledge of the contents. Plato's central question was how to live. Eliot's is more focused. How to live in a world without reason or meaning, a world that is only accidentally related to our needs, including the need for justice. Her world, like ours, is not only bereft of providence, but permanently threatened by the knowledge of our intimate connection to other animals. That knowledge can lead to what she calls the debasement of moral currency, that is, lowering the value of every inspiring fact and tradition, so it will combine less and less of the generous motives which sustain the charm of our social existence, that something besides bread which man saves his soul alive. The passage concludes with a reference to the moral mildew, that gentle sort of rot which spread through our culture and has mightily increased since Eliot's day. It turns emotions into Disney caricatures we can hardly distinguish from deeper feeling. It turns altruism into a problem for evolutionary psychologists to solve through ever more abstruse arguments. Between our selfish desires and talent for self-deception and a cosmos which neither rewards or reflects moral behavior, its possibility was always precarious. The ongoing debasement, call it deconstruction, of morality in every crevice of our culture makes its appearance seem positively heroic. It's a manuscript of Middlemarch. And that, I believe, is Eliot's point. From an 1876 letter, my writing is simply a set of experiments in life, an endeavor to see what our thought and emotions may be capable of, what motives give promises of a better after which we strive. Through those experiments, she means to show the possibility and the difficulty of moral behavior, always threatened by our animal interests and the contingencies that run through our lives. But no transcendental deduction of the conditions of possibility will help us. Heroes are needed to show that morality in the abstract is a living possibility. Given all the odds against it, we need to be reminded that there are some people who've actually overcome them. It's no accident that Mary Garth, the consistently best figure in Middlemarch, ends by writing a children's version of Plutarch's Lives. But from her very first novel, Eliot is adamantly disinterested in those great men whose lives Plutarch portrayed for the education and inspiration of well-educated youth. Her focus is rather on the everyday heroism of those who rest in unvisited tombs. Light is a word often found in her works, along with variations on the word vitality. That's a quality, as I noted in several previous lectures, which is notoriously resistant to definition. For all our inability to capture it, but in metaphor, where words like fire and light recur, vitality may be the most important feature of human being. The death of the soul, whether through external circumstance or our own wrong choices, looms as a threat over each of Eliot's novels. If keeping one's soul alive is not the only heroic act, it surely is a precondition of any task we may call heroic. Even more tragic is Lydgate's fate, for Lydgate begins with sheer vitality and a host of other virtues as well. He's passionate about work and determined that mammon shall never put a bit in his mouth. He's capable of heartfelt, if impulsive, love. Yet he is soon on that perilous margin when we begin to look passively at our future selves and see our own figures led with dull consent into insipid misdoing and shabby achievement. It's a peril to which all but the saints among us are exposed. No wonder the Spectator's review, The Melancholy of Middlemarch, wrote that George Eliot never makes the world worse than it is, but she makes it a shade darker. Yet a later reviewer wrote, her books are apt to close in gloom, but they leave you with courage. They contain the tonic of Stoicism, and no one can be ungrateful to Stoicism who has experienced the soundness of it in dark hours. Her Stoicism, however, contains no resignation. That's because she herself had that inadequately named vitality that radiates through her work and her life. For all his occasional carping, Henry James was only one of many who called her luminous. Though she was famously tolerant of most things, she was intolerant of those who find life dull as well as those who find their fellow creatures unattractive, holding that such indifference was due to the lack of vital energy in the complainer. Sorry, that was a quote. Eliot's great love for life, expressed to her close friend Barbara Bodichon, was compatible with her recurring bouts of depression. Some of her melancholy was a matter of principle, a product of honesty and empathy. Adam Bede states, "Surely it is not true blessedness to be free from sorrow while there's sorrow and sin in the world." Eliot and Lewis were bound by that consciousness. And if casual acquaintances could be put off by her intensity, they were merciless in speaking of Lewis. Given what they committed to paper, one wonders what they said of him in private. Here's a letter from Charles Eliot Norton. People tried very hard to get invited to the salons, and then, of course, they wrote long descriptions of who said what and what they did once they were there. Quote, "Lewis receives us at the door with characteristic animation. He looks and moves like an old French barber or dancing master, very ugly, very vivacious, very entertaining. You expect to see him take up his fiddle and begin to play. His talk is much more French than English in its liveliness, and in the grimace and gesture with which it is accomplished. All the action of his mind is rapid, and it is so full that it seems to be running over. He has what is hard to call a vulgar air, but at least there's something in his air which reminds you of vulgarity." End quote. Reminds you, this reader will respond. I'd rather say he was alive. And it's that, of course, that fed his prodigious intellectual accomplishments and won Marianne Evans' heart. With Klezmer's entrance to an aristocratic salon, and Daniel Deronda's clearly got pieces of Lewis in him, she captures the English contempt for the stray fireworks such a stranger could provide. That light again. However did she keep it? Part of it was simply the luck that brought her a very great love. But even after the devastation of Lewis's death, she told Barbara Bodichon that she must keep herself healthy, for she had much to do, since the world is so intensely interesting, he said. Her interest never waned. With the possible exception of Queen Victoria, she became the most famous woman in Britain. Yet she surprised many by going to the circus, conversing with farmers about pigs and butter, or putting her step-grandchildren's governess at ease by complimenting her lace and asking where she could get the same. Those who knew her better invariably admired her ability to listen, drawing out each speaker to best advantage. Though her main sights were always set on the good, she retained a lifetime commitment to the true. Not only her continuous scientific studies, but her relentless focus on the nuances of self-deception showed how the two connect. But was she beautiful or not beautiful? And so the passage in Daniel Deronda continues. And what was the secret of form or expression which gave the dynamic quality to her glance? End quote. Even George Eliot never found the words that reveal the secret. Like Gwendolen Harleth, it was less a matter of feature than fire. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan, for a fantastic, entertaining and interesting and stimulating gifted lecture. So we've got time for a few questions. I just briefly want to say, before we do that, I just need to tell you that The lecture series will continue tomorrow at the same time of 5:30. And the next lecture will be entitled Albert Einstein or How to Turn a Hero into a Celebrity. We're also holding an online discussion throughout the fortnight of the series on our Gifford Lectures blog, led by Victoria Turner of New College. And to follow and contribute to the discussion, you can access the blog via the Gifford Lectures web pages. And you're warmly invited to attend the Gifford Seminar held on Wednesday, the 11th of May, from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. at Rainey Hall in New College, details of which will be found on the Gifford website. And in the interest of time, I won't read out the other participants there. So we've now time for a few questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone to come to you before you speak.
Over there. There's someone over there.
I haven't forgotten the title of the lecture, which is, I think, Heroes Without Faith.
Wait, could you speak louder, please?
Was it
Just hold the mic next to your mouth, maybe.
the title being Heroes Without Faith? Is that correct? Were you referring to George Eliot there? Because what you're talking, you talk about her commitment to the good, and there's particularly a passage in Middlemarch where Dorothy is speaking to Ladislaw about religion. She seems to redefine religion not as what you know about religion, but the belief that helps you the most. And I really take that as George Eliot more than just Dorothea. So I don't know where this, I know it's not exactly like Christianity, but the idea of not faith.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And if you spend a lot of time reading Eliot and also all the, there's a lot of stuff written about Eliot from contemporaries who knew her. It's difficult to say. She retained throughout her life a respect for religious faith. She never shows any scorn. I mean, she's not Hume. She's not. There are all kinds of people who she's not. Okay, and she certainly would, but she's also not. Well, Hume thinks this, but also Voltaire. I mean, she's not the kind of person who says, as it were, well, for the lower classes or people who aren't as intelligent, they can retain faith if it helps them behave better, okay? Or even if it helps them through the night. Because, she wrestled with this. I mean, this was the crisis of her life. She started out as a schoolgirl, as a dissenter. I mean, she was the passages about Saint Teresa in Middlemarch, or there's a passage in her school book that has a poem. Oh, I forget. I'm not sure I can do it by heart, but oh, I wish I could be a saint. I mean, she says it better than that. Okay, so she was, passionately invested in becoming a kind of religious saint, and then this combination of scientific study made her feel that she could not, she just couldn't believe. She lost her faith. And she was still living at home, and there was a huge battle because she told her father that she wouldn't go to church with him because it would be dishonest. She didn't believe in any of the prayers or any of the rituals. And he actually turned her out of the house for a while. And they came to a compromise whereby she said she would go to church with him and sit by his side, but not pray, okay? So that's how they worked it out until her father died. Afterwards, though, I wouldn't even say that she was a deist, right? I think she would have thought deism is too easy. I mean, she has a respect for the best qualities that faith can provide, and she knows that it can provide those qualities, but she simply doesn't believe. She just feels, for all the reasons that I mentioned, this sort of combination of the geology that was, undermining the age of the earth as told in the Bible, the religious criticism of Strauss, and then, of course, Darwin. I mean, Darwin is sort of he's not really a deist either. He's not as hardcore a Darwinist as people later became, but his arguments, it was clear to people at the time, really undermined the idea of providence, which is so central to any kind of traditional religious faith. I hope that's an answer. I mean, you're pointing to something there are, not just there are other places where you think, is she kind of moving a little bit towards or back towards her childhood religion? But in all the statements that she made and everything we know about her practice, she gave up Christianity.
Yeah, I definitely agree she gave up Christianity.
Pardon?
I definitely agree with the Christianity part, but...
Yeah. But I don't think she's a deist either.
So there's somebody on the other side over there, right there. Sorry, you're going to get a bit of exercise.
That's fine.
Right the far way.
So I like your contrast between vitalism and sort of a Platonist or Aristotelian transparency that goodness and beauty can be seen. There's this transparency with that formula that Plato comes up with that people like, right? You can see it, you don't have to worry. But then this idea of vitalism, you keep referring to Charlotte Bronte and to Jane Austen, but maybe Mary Shelley is the place to go. And to think about the vitalism of the modern Prometheus that seems to be sparking, if you will, in George Eliot's work. So just something to think about.
Well, thank you. That's the second or third time you've given me a good reference to look up. I haven't thought about Shelley in this connection, and it would be good to do so. I do want to make clear, however, that both I and Eliot don't want to assert the Platonic equivalence of the true, the good, and the beautiful, but to problematize it. And just she's thinking about it all the time. And I'm not sure we've stopped, actually. So just to make that clear, she certainly doesn't agree that they're all connected, but she's thinking about it.
Well,
Okay.
I think the Victorians would love that.
Sure.
Right? And that Eliot and other writers in the period are really trying to complicate that because, of course, you've got this, even though the slave trade has ended in 1807 and the slaves were emancipated in 1833, you still have these issues of race that are circulating. You still have the capitalist economy that is really making a moral vision of the world very difficult to see
Sure.
and imagine.
Sure, and I think you can make an argument that her last novel, Daniel Deronda, is raising all of those questions and kind of gives up on contemporary Britain, doesn't think that it's salvageable.
Perhaps that's the note we should finish on. We'll have one more question here.
My recollection is that George Eliot translated Feuerbach's Essence of Christianity. How did she manage to avoid being as influenced by Feuerbach as she was by Strauss when one considers the impact of Feuerbach in the Berlin Doctor Club and what went on in the left-wing Hegelians?
She was very influenced by Feuerbach for a while, and she talks about a religion of humanity And again, as you can see, I was really trying to limit. I mean, I went nuts over Eliot, although I spent many months reading everything I could. I still tried to compress it into something like a listenable lecture. But yes, she went through phases and was very taken with Feuerbach for a while. And I think, I'm not sure what finally, in her life gave the last blow to this Feuerbachian view. I suspect it was Darwin, but I'm not 100% sure of that. I spent months and months reading, rereading everything that she published. Her correspondence is voluminous, and I did not read all of it. So it's quite incredible how she did all of that. I mean, she wrote these, volumes of letters, both to people she knew and people she didn't know, while writing this, all of these novels and essays.
Because presumably she came to represent all that, let's say, Marx utterly loathed about bourgeois existence, didn't she?
I don't see it that way. That's why I think Felix Holt is so interesting. And it's an ambivalent novel, but she does say very clearly, I am a radical, I desire change, and I expect it. She's extraordinarily critical, even after Felix Holt, of just the foundation of British society in Daniel Deronda. And the only place she sees hope is for Daniel Deronda to go off to the East, right? But, so I have to say this. When I was reading Felix Holt and the description of the Sproxton riot, okay, I could not but think of the January 6th insurrection at the US Capitol, and the ways in which people who claim to be acting in the interests of the people abuse them, lead them into violence, and they're able to do so because of fake news. I mean, of a lack of education, a lack of an ability to make certain kinds of judgments. It was a very eerie experience because, I mean, my own political inclinations are, very decidedly social democrat or socialist, and it's hard to read about a mob until, of course, I couldn't but think of the mob that my country has witnessed, and close to 50% of the US population still thinks was a good thing. So I get it.
That's a fantastic contemporary analogy to finish on. But Susan, thank you very much for a superb lecture. Thank you to the audience for coming this evening. Thank you for your contributions. And until 5:30 tomorrow, that's the end of this particular installment. But thank you very much, everybody, for coming.